Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission here, well, it's pretty simple. We take these big, sometimes intimidating intellectual ideas, the kind that connect whole fields, and we try to break them down into something useful, something essential.
And today, we're really diving deep. We're tackling the philosophy of John Searle.
Yeah, a huge figure. This is someone who's genuinely tried to solve some of the biggest puzzles in Western thought, not just, manage them.
Exactly. He's looking at how we fit our conscious selves, our rational lives, our whole civilization into a universe that physics tells us is just, well, meaningless physical particles.
He calls it trying to give an account of ourselves that actually lines up with physics, right?
That's the core project.
Yeah.
Trying to make sense of how we get from atoms to arguments, essentially.
It sounds like a real tightrope walk. You've got the objective physical world on one side,
Yeah.
rocks, energy, forces.
Cold, hard facts.
And then on the other, there's us. Subjective experience, meaning language, governments, right and wrong. Bridging that gap seems like the central problem.
And it's a problem deeply rooted in history. Searle argues, quite strongly I think, that a lot of these debates, especially about the mind, are stuck using what he calls an outmoded 17th century vocabulary.
Ah, you mean Descartes, mind versus body.
Precisely. That sharp split created problems that philosophy has been wrestling with ever since. Intractable problems, really.
And Searle sees this legacy leading to what he calls the twin curses. What are those?
Okay, so the first curse is the traditional view, the legacy of, God, the soul, immortality. This view insists consciousness is fundamentally not physical. It's something extra, outside the ordinary causal world.
Right, the ghost in the machine idea.
Exactly. But the second curse, and this is the surprising part, is scientific materialism. Searle says it makes the same basic mistake.
Wait, how? Materialism is all about the physical world. How can it make the same mistake as the soul tradition?
Because materialism often looks at consciousness subjectivity, the what it's like feeling, and says, this doesn't fit our standard physical models. It's not objective like a neuron firing.
So they conclude.
Well, they often conclude either that consciousness doesn't really exist, it's just an illusion, maybe, or that it's so weird and different it falls outside of serious objective science.
Ah, I see. So both traditions, in their own way, end up treating consciousness as something not really part of the ordinary biological world.
Precisely. And Searle's entire project, really, is to push back hard against that. He insists consciousness is a biological phenomenon, ordinary, natural, part of the physical world, just like digestion or photosynthesis.
Okay, let's dig into that core claim then. Because if he can make that stick locating the mind in the brain without just explaining it away, then the rest of his system kind of follows. His solution is called biological naturalism. What are the key parts?
It's built on two main pillars. First, causality. Mental stuff, our thoughts, feelings, pains, they're entirely caused by processes happening down at the neurobiological level in the brain. Nerve firings, neurotransmitters, all that.
Okay, caused by brain processes. What's the second part?
The second part is realization. These mental states aren't just caused by the brain. They are simultaneously realized in the brain structure. They are features of the brain system itself.
So not some separate substance floating around, but an actual high-level property of the biological system.
Exactly. Like digestion is a property of the digestive system. Consciousness is a property of the brain system at the right level of complexity. It's biological, through and through.
Okay. Moving consciousness firmly into biology.
Yeah.
Makes sense. But this is usually where people get stuck, right?
Mm-hmm.
How can physical brain stuff cause something that feels subjective, like the redness of red or the pain of a headache? It's hard to picture.
It is hard to picture, and that's why Searle offers his famous analogy, the liquidity of water.
Ah, yes, the water analogy. Let's walk through that carefully because it seems pretty critical.
Okay, so water is made of H2O molecules. Individually, a single H2O molecule isn't wet. It isn't liquid. It just follows basic physical and chemical laws.
Right, it's just doing its molecule thing.
But when you get trillions of them together, interacting in a certain way, bonding, moving, some of them, the system displays the property of liquidity or wetness. Liquidity is caused by all that micro-level molecular behavior.
And it's also realized in that system of molecules. You can't have liquidity without the molecules arranged in that way.
Exactly. And it would be, well, a kind of a philosophical mistake, a category error, to point to one single H2O molecule and ask, is this molecule wet? Wetness only exists at the system level.
Okay, so applying that to the brain.
The logic holds, Searle argues. We could look at a whole functioning brain system and say this system is conscious, or this system is experiencing thirst. But it's nonsense to point to one single neuron and ask, Is this neuron feeling thirsty?
The mental state is a property of the whole system, caused by the interactions of the lower-level parts, the neurons.
That's the idea. It's a high-level feature caused by and realized in the low-level neurobiology.
Okay, here's where I sometimes feel the analogy gets a bit stretched, maybe. With water, we actually know the physics. We understand how the molecular interactions lead to liquidity. We've got the whole causal story, the plumbing figured out.
Right.
But with consciousness, we don't. We know that the brain causes it, presumably, but we have no idea how. Doesn't not knowing the mechanism weaken the claim that it's just biological?
That's a fair challenge, and it definitely points to a huge gap in our current neuroscience.
Yeah.
But Searle would argue it doesn't weaken the philosophical claim,
How so?
because the claim is primarily metaphysical. It's saying there's no logical or conceptual reason why consciousness can't be a physical, biological property caused by and realized in the brain. We accept, for example, that brain processes cause vision, even if we don't know every single step in intricate detail. The difference with consciousness, Searle argues, is just one of complexity, and maybe our inherent difficulty in studying subjectivity. It's not a difference in ontological kind. Consciousness is a physical property of the brain system. Finding out the exact how is a massive scientific task for neurobiologists, but it doesn't require us to invent some non-physical realm.
Got it. So the lack of a mechanism is a scientific problem to be solved, not a reason to abandon naturalism.
Precisely. And this sets up his critique of a major confusion he sees in cognitive science, mixing up two different ways things can be objective or subjective.
Right. This confusion is apparently what blocks a real science of mind.
He thinks so. It leads to that mistaken syllogism. Science demands objectivity. Consciousness is subjective. Therefore, no science of consciousness is possible. Searle says, hold on, we need to distinguish ontological subjectivity from epistemic objectivity.
Okay, let's break that down. Ontological subjectivity. That's about how something exists.
Yes, it's mode of existence. Mental states like pains, tickles, beliefs, hopes, they only exist because they are being experienced by some subject, some person or animal. They have a first-person ontology.
So my headache exists only while I'm feeling it. If I stop feeling it, the headache literally ceases to exist no matter what anyone else thinks.
Exactly. That's ontological subjectivity.
But you're saying that doesn't mean we can't study it objectively.
Right, because we can still make epistemically objective claims about those ontologically subjective states. Epistemic objectivity is about the truth conditions of our statements. Can the claim be settled as true or false, independent of the attitudes or biases of the people making or assessing the claim?
Okay, I need an example. How do those two work together in practice?
Sure. Imagine a doctor examines a patient and says, based on the scans and symptoms, this patient is experiencing severe pain from their condition. The pain itself is ontologically subjective. It only exists in the patient's experience. But the doctor's statement about the pain, that's intended as an epistemically objective claim. We can gather evidence, physiological signs, patient reports, medical history, to determine if the statement is true or false, regardless of whether the doctor personally likes the patient or whether the nurse believes them.
I see. The existence of the pain is first person, but the claim about its existence can be third person, verifiable or objective in the scientific sense.
Precisely. So the error, Searle argues, is thinking that because the experience itself is subjective, ontological, any study or claim about it must also be subjective, epistemic, and therefore unscientific.
But we make objective claims about subjective things all the time. Like economics makes objective claims about people's desires and preferences, which are subjective states.
Exactly. Or even simpler, we make objective claims about whether a computer is running a certain program, even though the program running state is arguably observer relative, depending on interpretation. Searle insists that failing to see this distinction between ontology and epistemology is a major roadblock in the philosophy of mind.
Okay, so mind is biological, subjective in its existence, but open to objective study. Now, the crucial follow-up. Does it actually do anything? This is the worry about epiphenomenalism, right? That consciousness is just like steam from a train engine, noticeable, but not actually making the train move.
Right, the fear that our conscious thoughts, decisions, intentions are just foam, useless byproducts. But intuitively and practically, that seems wrong. I decide to raise my arm, and then, while my arm goes up, my conscious intention seems undeniably causal. This is top-down causation.
But how does that work physically? If my thought is just a high-level feature, how does it push atoms around? Doesn't physics say physical events need physical causes? Where does the energy come from if the thought itself isn't just neurons firing?
This is where the elegance of biological naturalism comes back in. The mental event is a physical event, just described at a higher level of the system. So when you have the conscious intention to raise your arm, that's the top-down description, that very same event is also a complex pattern of specific neurophysiological activity happening at the lower level. Nerve firings, muscle signals, the whole chain. That's the bottom-up description of the same event.
So the conscious decision isn't adding some magical non-physical energy.
No, it is the physical state, organized in a particular way. The consciousness is the pattern or structure of those lower-level physical events.
Right.
The causal work is all done by the neurons and molecules at the bottom level. The causation bounces entirely along the bottom, as Searle puts it.
But the reason those neurons fire in that specific coordinated arm-raising pattern is because of the system's overall state, which is the conscious intention.
Exactly. The conscious state organizes and directs the lower-level processes. It's not bypassing physics. It's harnessing it. Ignoring the conscious level means you miss the actual causal explanation for why that specific pattern of neural firing occurred, leading to the arm raising, rather than some other random twitch.
So the mental state isn't just real, it's causally real. It's an active part of the physical world's unfolding, a causal realist position.
That's right. And denying this causal role leads back to that big biological puzzle you mentioned earlier.
The paradox of the expensive illusion.
Yeah. Think about conscious deliberation. Sitting down, weighing options, deciding complex things like where to go to university or who to vote for, that's incredibly resource-intensive for the brain.
Needs a lot of blood flow, energy, years of learning.
Huge biological cost. Now, if that whole elaborate, costly process of conscious reasoning and deciding has no actual causal effect on the final action, if the outcome was already baked in by the lower level of physics and the conscious part was just a sideshow, an epiphenomenon.
Then why would evolution ever select for such an expensive, useless feature?
Exactly. Natural selection typically favors efficiency. It doesn't usually build complex, energy-guzzling systems that do nothing. This makes the idea that consciousness is causally inert look very suspicious from a straightforward biological perspective.
Okay, so if the mind is biological, causal, and real, what does that mean for attempts to create minds, specifically with computers? This brings us to probably Searle's most famous, or maybe infamous, argument, the Chinese room.
Launched in 1980, yeah. And it caused, and still causes, a huge stir. His target here is very specific, though. Strong AI.
Not just any AI research, but strong AI. What's the claim of strong AI?
Strong AI is the philosophical view that if you could just design the right computer program, the right set of rules, and run it on a machine, that running program wouldn't just simulate a mind, it would literally be a mind. It would have genuine understanding, thoughts, consciousness, just like us.
So the computation itself is the thinking.
That's the core claim it makes. And before we get into the thought experiment, we need to nail down the key distinction Searle uses to attack it. Syntax versus semantics.
Okay. Syntax is the rules, the structure.
Yeah. Syntax refers to the formal rules for manipulating symbols, based purely on their shape or structure, like the grammar rules of a language or the code in a computer program, the patterns of zeros and ones. It's form without content.
And semantics.
Semantics is the meaning, the content, what the symbols are actually about. Understanding, reference, interpretation.
And Searle's big claim, the foundation of the Chinese room, is?
Syntax is not sufficient for semantics. You can't get meaning just by shuffling symbols according to rules. Formal processes alone don't create understanding.
Got it. Okay, let's step inside the Chinese room. What's the setup?
Imagine you, someone who doesn't understand a word of Chinese, spoken or written, are locked in a room. Inside, there are huge baskets full of Chinese characters or symbols. These are the inputs, though you don't know their questions in Chinese.
Okay, just meaningless squiggles to me.
Exactly. You also have a massive rulebook, written entirely in English, a language you do understand. This rulebook is the program. It tells you how to manipulate the Chinese symbols based purely on their shapes, their syntax.
So the rulebook might say, if you get a squiggle that looks like this, find a squiggle that looks like that in basket C, and pair it with a squiggle like this other one from basket F, and pass the pair out under the door. Purely formal instructions.
Purely formal. You don't need to know what any of it means. You just follow the rules meticulously. You get Chinese symbols in, you follow the syntactic rules in the English book, and you pass Chinese symbols out.
And let's say the rulebook is incredibly sophisticated. It's the perfect AI program for answering questions in Chinese. So the symbols I pass out are actually perfect, coherent answers to the questions coming in.
Right. To someone outside the room, a native Chinese speaker, your output is indistinguishable from that of a native speaker. You pass the Turing test for understanding Chinese perfectly.
Okay.
But Searle asks, do you, the person inside the room manipulating the symbols, understand a single word of Chinese?
No, not at all. I'm just following rules about shapes. I have zero idea what the questions are or what my answers mean.
Exactly. You have perfectly implemented the syntax, the program, but you have no semantics, no understanding.
So the conclusion is, if the person running the program doesn't understand Chinese and the program itself is just the formal rules, syntax, then manipulating symbols according to rules can't by itself generate real understanding semantics.
That's the core of it. Formal symbol manipulation isn't enough for genuine intentionality, the kind of meaning we have.
Now, I know this argument got a lot of pushback, especially from AI researchers and cognitive scientists. What was one of the main replies, the systems reply?
Yeah. The systems reply is probably the most famous counter. It goes something like this. Okay, Searle, sure, the man inside the room doesn't understand Chinese, but you're looking in the wrong place. It's the entire system. The man, the room, the baskets, the rule book, all working together that understands Chinese.
So understanding isn't in the CPU, the man. It's an emergent property of the whole system.
That's the claim. But Searle has a pretty direct counter-rebuttal. He says, okay, let the person in the room memorize everything. Memorize the rules, memorize the contents of the baskets, do all the lookups and manipulations internally in their own head.
Okay, so now I am the entire system. Everything is inside my head.
Right. Does a person now understand Chinese? Searle says, obviously not. You still only have access to the formal rules and the shapes. You're just running the program internally. Memorizing syntax doesn't magically create semantic understanding.
So just making the system more complex, even internalizing it, doesn't bridge that fundamental gap between syntax and semantics.
That's his point. More syntax doesn't give you semantics. This leads him to another important point about how we talk about computers, what he calls the observer-relative trap.
Okay, what's that?
We use psychological words all the time for computers. We say the computer remembers something, or it decided to do this, or it has intelligence. But Searle insists these terms have two fundamentally different senses.
Right. There's the sense that applies to us humans.
That's the observer-independent sense. Our thoughts, memories, intentions, they are psychologically real. They exist intrinsically within us, regardless of whether someone else is interpreting our behavior. My feeling of thirst is real, whether you believe me or not.
And the other sense?
That's the observer-relative sense. This is when we, as observers or users, ascribe meaning or function to the machine's physical states or outputs. When we say the chess program wants to control the center of the board, it's not feeling ambition. It's executing algorithms that we interpret as strategic intent.
Or when I say my word processor knows how to spell check, it doesn't know in the human sense. It's matching patterns based on its programming. The knowing is relative to my interpretation of its function.
Precisely. And here's the crucial and maybe most radical part of Searle's claim. Computation itself is observer-relative.
Wait, computation isn't a basic physical fact, like mass or charge.
Not according to Searle. A hunk of silicon doesn't intrinsically compute anything. It just has physical states that change according to physical laws. We use those physical state changes, we interpret them, according to a symbolic mapping, as computation. The computation exists only relative to an observer or designer who assigns semantic content to the syntactic manipulations.
So the physical processes are observer independent, but the fact that those processes count as running a specific program or performing a calculation depends on our interpretation.
Yes. Without an interpreter, it's just physics happening.
Okay, so the big takeaway from that for AI is?
In the strict, observer-independent, psychologically real sense, the sense in which we have intelligence, the computer, the hardware running a program, has literally zero intelligence. It's not just dumber than us. It's not even playing the same game. It doesn't have intrinsic intentionality.
Wow. That's a strong claim. So the whole project of computationalism, the idea that the mind is a computer program?
Is fundamentally mistaken, according to Searle. It confuses the simulation of a mental process with the real thing.
He uses that digestion analogy again here.
Yeah. He says, imagine you build a perfect computer simulation of digestion. It models every enzyme, every chemical reaction perfectly. You input data for a virtual pizza.
The simulation outputs data representing metabolized nutrients.
Right. But nobody thinks the computer actually digested anything. You can't eat the output data. The simulation captures the formal structure, the syntax of digestion, but it doesn't duplicate the actual causal powers of a real stomach.
And he says the same applies to the mind. Simulating thinking isn't the same as actually thinking.
Exactly. A simulation of consciousness isn't conscious. To build a truly conscious machine, you wouldn't just simulate brain processes. You'd need to build something that duplicates the specific causal powers of the brain that produce consciousness.
And since we don't know what those causal powers are yet.
We're nowhere near building a conscious machine simply by writing better code. We need to understand the biology first.
Okay, so if computation isn't the key, and the mind is this biological causal feature, let's look closer at consciousness itself. Searle argues we need to stop treating it like some deep mystery and just analyze its actual features. What does he identify as the main ones?
He lists 4 key features typically. First, qualitativeness, often called qualia. This is the simple fact that conscious states feel like something. There's a what it's like aspect to tasting chocolate, seeing red, or feeling pain.
That subjective feel. Got it. Second,
subjectivity, which we already touched on. Conscious states only exist as experienced by a subject. They have that first-person mode of existence.
Okay.
Third
is unity. Our conscious experiences aren't usually fragmented little bits. They come as a single, unified field. Right now, I'm aware of speaking, seeing you, hearing the room tone, feeling the chair. It's all integrated into one coherent conscious experience happening now.
like a unified movie, not separate frames scattered around.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
Come on, it's called the binding problem. How does the brain bind all these disparate inputs into one field? And fourth is intentionality, meaning consciousness is always about something, directed at something.
Yes, it represents things, refers to things, points beyond itself. I don't just have a belief. I have a belief that it will rain. I don't just feel desire. I desire that specific cup of coffee. Consciousness connects the organism to the world.
Okay, qualitativeness, subjectivity, unity, intentionality. Now, as someone closer to cognitive science, how does current brain research look when viewed through this Slorlin lens? Does it address these features adequately?
Well, that's where Searle sees some major, let's call them blind spots, or at least limitations, particularly regarding unity. A lot of current neuroscience focuses on finding neural correlates of consciousness, or NCCs.
Right, trying to find the specific brain activity that matches up with a specific conscious experience.
Exactly. Think of those studies using ambiguous figures, like the duck-rabbit illusion. The picture on the screen stays the same, but your experience flips between seeing a duck and seeing a rabbit. Researchers look for the burst of neural activity that correlates precisely with the moment of flipping.
And they find correlations, right? Specific brain areas light up.
They do find correlations. But Searle's criticism is that these NCC studies are almost always too local. They're focusing on finding the correlate for a specific content within consciousness, seeing the duck versus seeing the rabbit.
Okay, what's wrong with that?
What's wrong is that they typically take the overall state of consciousness for granted. These studies are done on subjects who are already awake, already experiencing a unified conscious field. They find the correlate of a change within that field, but they completely sidestep the much bigger, more fundamental question.
Which is?
How does the brain generate the unified conscious field itself in the first place? Before you can see a duck or a rabbit, you need to be conscious at all. NCC research often looks for the difference between state A and state B within consciousness, without explaining how the background state of being conscious arises from brain activity.
It's like trying to figure out why the TV is showing channel 4 instead of channel 5, without having any clue how the TV turns on or creates a picture at all.
That's a great analogy. You're studying the contents without understanding the container, or rather the process that creates the container and the contents together as a unified whole. Searle argues we need a theory of the general mechanism of consciousness before we can make real sense of the localized NCCs.
We need the ignition sequence for consciousness.
Something like that. How do billions of separate neuron firings bind together into one subjective field? That's the deep question NCC studies often don't address.
Okay, let's zoom in on intentionality for a moment. You mentioned it's about directedness. How does Searle see perception, seeing, hearing, touching as a specific kind of intentionality different from, say, believing something?
Perception is unique because it involves a direct presentation of the object or state of affairs. When I see the coffee cup, it feels like the cup is directly present to me, right here, right now. Beliefs and desires are different. They're more like representations about things that might be absent or abstract.
They feel less immediate, less compelling.
Exactly. Searle talks about how beliefs and desires can be easily shoveled around you, can change your mind, revise a belief based on new evidence. Perception feels much more direct and forceful. It presents the world as being a certain way.
And this ties into his ideas about causality in experience, right? Not just us causing actions, but the world causing our experiences.
Yes, this is crucial. In perception, part of the experience itself is the feeling that the world is causing you to have that experience. When I see the table, the experience includes the sense that the table out there is the source, the cause of my visual experience in here.
There's a built-in causal phenomenology.
Right. And this is why Searle thinks a major historical argument in philosophy, the argument from illusion, is a complete disaster.
The idea that because we can be fooled by illusions or hallucinations, we never really see the external world directly. That goes back to Descartes, Locke, Kant.
Yes, that whole tradition. The argument basically says, look, sometimes you hallucinate or see an illusion like a stick looking bent in water. That internal experience can be identical to a real, true perception.
Okay.
Since you can't always tell the difference between a true perception and a convincing illusion just by looking at the internal experience itself, the conclusion drawn was that what you always perceive directly is only your own internal representation, your sense data, never the external object itself. You're trapped behind a veil of perception.
So we're always just watching the movie in our head, never seeing the actual actors.
That's the picture it paints. But Searle says this is a massive logical foul.
Why? What's the mistake?
It confuses the possibility of failure with the impossibility of success. Just because the process of perception can sometimes go wrong, as in hallucination or illusion, doesn't mean it never goes right.
So when perception is working properly,
When it's veridical, when I genuinely see the coffee cup, Searle insists the external object itself, the actual cup, is part of what causes my visual experience through interaction with my sensory system. I'm seeing the real cup.
and in the hallucination case,
In the hallucination, I might have the same type of visual experience, but it's being caused by something internal, maybe random neural firing or drugs or whatever. The external object isn't part of the causal chain.
so the argument from illusion mistakenly assumes that because the internal effect can be the same in both cases, the entire causal process must be the same, meaning we're always just looking at internal effects.
Exactly. It fails to see that in the good case, the external world is the cause and, in a sense, part of the perception itself. The bad case, hallucination, just shows the internal mechanism can sometimes be triggered abnormally.
So Searle wants to restore that direct perceptual connection to the world.
Absolutely. It's vital for his naturalism. It anchors the conscious, subjective mind directly to the objective physical world through causal interaction. We're not locked inside our own heads. Perception, when working, gives us direct access.
Okay, we've grounded the individual mind in biology. Now, how do we get from individual minds to complex societies? The bridge, obviously, is language. What makes human language so special, so different from, say, animal communication?
Language is this incredibly powerful tool built on top of our basic biological intentionality. Searle highlights two key structural features that make it unique: compositionality and generativity.
Compositionality. That's the idea that the meaning of a sentence depends on the meaning of the words and how they're put together, the syntax.
Right. Dog bites man means something different from man bites dog just by changing the order, using the same parts.
And generativity.
That's the amazing ability to generate a potentially infinite number of new, meaningful sentences from a finite set of words and rules. We can understand and produce sentences nobody has ever uttered before. No animal communication system seems to have this open-ended combinatorial power.
But language use is often way more complex than just literal meaning, isn't it? We use metaphors, irony, hints. The speaker meaning what I intend to convey can be very different from the literal sentence meaning. How do we manage that?
Searle says we rely heavily on two crucial background capacities that are not strictly linguistic themselves. First, the network.
The network of.
The network of our other beliefs, desires, intentions, background knowledge. To understand even a simple utterance, you have to place it within this wider web of mental states. If I say, "Can you reach the salt?" the literal sentence is a question about your physical ability.
But the speaker meaning is usually a request. Please pass the salt.
Exactly. And you understand that request because you access your network of beliefs about politeness, context, shared goals at the dinner table, and so on. The sentence meaning alone isn't enough.
Okay, the network of mental states. What's the second thing?
The second, even deeper capacity he calls the background. This is harder to pin down, but it's basically our set of pre-intentional, non-representational skills, abilities, stances, and know-how for coping with the world.
So, not beliefs that something is the case, but more like knowing how to do things, how things typically work.
Yes, our fundamental orientation towards reality. Think about understanding the sentence, he opened the door. The sentence doesn't specify how he opened it. Did he use a key? Turn a knob? Push it? Pull it? Which way did it swing?
Right, tons of unstated details.
But our background abilities immediately fill that in with default assumptions based on our embodied experience with doors. We assume he used his hand, not his foot, that the door opened outwards or inwards in a normal way, etc. This vast set of unspoken, taken-for-granted coping skills forms the necessary foundation for language to even function.
So, language always operates against this backdrop of shared practices and know-how.
Always. No linguistic rule can ever be fully explicit. It always relies on the background for its application.
Before we build society, let's touch quickly on a specific language puzzle. Proper names, like Socrates or London. Searle had a particular view here, differing from, say, Frege.
Right. The traditional view associated with Frege and Russell was that a proper name works like a disguised, definite description. Aristotle might mean the student of Plato and teacher of Alexander the Great. The name refers to whatever uniquely fits that description.
But Searle thought that was wrong.
Yeah, he argued against it. What if we discovered that, actually, Plato had no student named Aristotle who taught Alexander? Maybe those were two different guys. Would he then say Aristotle never existed?
Probably not. We'd likely say our descriptions of Aristotle were wrong.
Exactly. So Searle proposed that a proper name doesn't stand for one specific description, but rather functions as a kind of hook or peg on which we hang a whole cluster of descriptions.
A collection of beliefs about the person or place.
Yes. And the name successfully refers if the object satisfies enough of the descriptions in the cluster, but maybe not all of them, and not necessarily any single essential one. Crucially, there's an inherent vagueness here.
Vagueness? That sounds like a bad thing for meaning.
But Searle argues this vagueness is essential for how names work in practice. We don't need a precise definition or a checklist. The name functions to pick out the same individual across changes in our beliefs about them. It's loose enough to survive discoveries that some of our descriptions were mistaken. That looseness is a feature, not a bug.
Okay, interesting. So we have language operating with a network and background, allowing flexible reference, even with names. How does this launch us into full-blown institutional reality, money, marriage, government, property?
This is where Searle's work gets really groundbreaking, I think. He argues that these social institutions are created and maintained by two fundamental human capacities combined. First, collective intentionality.
Our ability to share goals and cooperate, like we are going for a walk, not just I am walking and you happen to be walking near me.
Precisely. The sense of shared activity and joint commitment. The second capacity is the uniquely human ability to impose status functions onto objects, people, or events.
Status functions. That's when we make something count as something else, giving it a function it doesn't have just from its physics.
Exactly. A wall can function as a barrier purely due to its physical structure. But a line of stones, or just a line painted on the ground, can also function as a boundary marker. That function isn't inherent in the stones or paint, it's a status we collectively assign to them.
They only work as a boundary because we agree they do.
Right. And Searle identifies the underlying logical structure of all these status functions. It takes a form. X counts as Y in context C.
Okay, break that down. X, Y, C.
X is some physical object, person, or event like a piece of paper with specific markings, or a person uttering certain words. Y is the status or function we impose on X, like being a $20 bill or being married. And C is the context or institution within which this assignment of function holds, like the U.S. monetary system or the legal system governing marriage.
So this piece of paper, X, counts as money, Y, within the context of our society's economic rules, C. Or raising my hand, X, counts as voting yes, Y, in the context of this meeting's rule, C.
Precisely. The power of the Y term comes entirely from the collective acceptance or recognition of that status function within that context. It's not derived from the physical properties of the X term itself.
And how are these status functions actually brought into existence? We don't just silently agree?
Often, they are created through a specific type of speech act that Searle calls a declaration. Declarations have unique power. They make something the case simply by representing it as being the case.
They change reality just by being uttered.
Yes, within the right institutional context. When the authorized person says, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the utterance itself, if successful, creates the marriage. When the chairperson says, "This meeting is adjourned," the meeting becomes adjourned. Or when a government declares war, These linguistic acts create institutional facts.
Wow. So much of human civilization, money, property rights, contracts, laws, nations, universities, it's all built out of layers and layers of these X counts as Y and C structures, often created and maintained through declarations.
That's Searle's analysis. It's a reality constructed through language and collective intentionality, resting ultimately on a physical base, but with powers and functions that go far beyond mere physics.
And what's the main point of creating all this institutional reality? What function does it serve?
Primarily, Searle argues, it serves to create and regulate power structures. But not just power in the sense of physical force. It creates a special kind of reason for acting.
Okay.
Institutional facts create desire-independent reasons for action. These are obligations, commitments, rights, duties that provide reasons for us to act in certain ways, regardless of our immediate inclinations or desires.
That sounds counterintuitive. Usually we think reasons for acting stem from our desires. I desire water, so I have a reason to get some.
Right, that's the standard model for basic biological drives. But institutional reality flips this. Think about making a promise.
Okay, I promise to meet you for lunch tomorrow.
By making that utterance, a declaration in Searle's terms, you create an institutional fact, an obligation. That obligation now exists as a reason for you to show up tomorrow.
Even if tomorrow morning I really don't feel like going, my desire has changed, but the reason persists.
Exactly. The obligation, the desire-independent reason created by the promise, provides a reason for action that isn't dependent on your current desires. Ideally, your recognition of that valid reason then motivates you to form the desire to fulfill the promise, or at least to act on the reason despite lacking the desire.
So the reason comes first, rooted in the institution, and the desire, or the will to act, follows from recognizing the reason.
That's the crucial feature of these social structures. Think about property rights. The fact that this land is yours, an institutional fact, X land counts as Y property in context C law, gives me a desire-independent reason not to trespass, even if I strongly desire to take a shortcut across it.
Or paying taxes. The obligation exists independently of my desire to pay.
Right. These desire-independent reasons, rights, duties, obligations, commitments, permissions generated by status functions are the glue that holds society together. They allow for stable cooperation, planning, and complex social order that goes far beyond what's possible based on individual desires or brute force alone. It's how we structure power and regulate behavior through shared acceptance of symbolic reality. #outro.
Okay, let's zoom back out. What Searle seems to have given us is this remarkably coherent picture. He starts with biology, naturalizes the mind without eliminating subjectivity, critiques the limits of pure computation, and then shows how language builds on that biological mind to construct the entire edifice of human, social, and institutional reality, all within one consistent physical world.
Yeah, it's a powerful synthesis. He really tries to connect the dots from physics all the way up to politics and ethics, using this consistent set of conceptual tools. He brings mind and society down from the clouds, grounding them in biology and shared human practices.
No need for spooky stuff, but also no need for crude reductionism that denies the reality of our experience or our institutions.
Exactly. But even after all that, even if you buy into biological naturalism and the construction of social reality, Searle himself admits there's one massive philosophical problem left standing, maybe even made starker by his framework.
And that is the freedom of the will.
Ah, the big one. Does all this deterministic-sounding biology and neurology leave any room for genuine freedom?
Well, that's the problem. We all have this powerful, pervasive experience of freedom. When we make a conscious choice, say, deciding whether to raise your left hand or your right hand there feels like a pause, a gap.
The gap, yeah, the feeling that between considering the options and actually acting, I could genuinely choose either way. Nothing feels like it's forcing the decision.
Exactly. We experience a gap between the reasons for the action, our beliefs, desires, and the actual initiation of the action. In that gap, we feel radically free. We feel like we could have done otherwise.
But how does that square with the brain being a biological, physical system? That's the dilemma. Hypothesis 1. The brain is, like other physical systems, fundamentally deterministic. Every state, including the state that leads to raising your right hand, is necessitated by prior physical states according to physical laws.
So if determinism is true at the brain level,
Then the experience of freedom, that feeling in the gap, must be a complete illusion, a systematic, pervasive illusion. Your choice was already determined by the neurobiological plumbing. You just felt like you were choosing freely.
ouch. Okay, what's hypothesis 2?
Hypothesis 2. Free will is real. Our conscious, rational deliberation in that gap actually makes a difference. We genuinely could have done otherwise. But if that's true, it seems to require some break in the deterministic causal chain of the physical brain.
Where would that break come from?
Well, this is where it gets really speculative and uncomfortable, even for Searle. Maybe consciousness somehow harnesses quantum indeterminacy at the neuronal level.
Yeah.
He admits it sounds preposterous because randomness doesn't seem like the basis for rational freedom either. But rejecting determinism seems to force us towards something like that if freedom is to have a real physical foothold.
So either freedom is a complete illusion, or we need some currently unknown neurobiology that allows consciousness to genuinely intervene in the causal flow, possibly exploiting indeterminism. Neither sounds great.
It's a deeply unsatisfying situation, and it brings us right back to that biological paradox we discussed much earlier, but now focused on freedom itself.
The costly illusion argument again.
Yes. Think about how incredibly complex and biologically expensive the whole apparatus of conscious, rational decision-making is. The huge brain, the long development time, the education, the constant energy supply, all apparently evolved to support this process of deliberating and choosing in the gap. Now, if that entire experience of free rational choice is just an epiphenomenal overlay, if it has zero causal impact on what we actually do because our actions are already determined by the underlying neurobiology, then evolution has produced an astonishingly elaborate, resource-intensive, and completely pointless illusion.
Why evolve the feeling of being in the driver's seat if the car is actually on rails?
Exactly. It seems like a massive violation of biological parsimony. Why would natural selection favor such a costly feature if it does nothing? It forces you to wonder.
Is the overwhelming experience of freedom itself evidence that it can't just be an illusion? Is that feeling pointing towards a gap in our understanding of physics and biology, rather than just being a trick played by deterministic processes?
That's the provocative question Searle leaves us with. Is our deepest sense of self, our agency, our freedom, the most profound reality about us, hinting at a nature we don't yet grasp? Or is it biology's most magnificent and perhaps cruelest sleight of hand?
Definitely something to keep wrestling with. A fascinating journey through Searle's attempt to give us a unified account of ourselves. Thank you for walking us through that.
It was a pleasure. It certainly makes you think.
Indeed. Until next time on The Deep Dive, keep questioning those background assumptions and maybe ponder just how free your next decision really is.